To punish Saddam Hussein for invading Kuwait and to make sure he doesn't do anything like that again or worse, the UN imposed sanctions on Iraq, the harshest, most comprehensive sanctions in modern times. Very little goes into the country, virtually no oil goes out. We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca, co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and socialist Kenny Cepeda. We're online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find our personal social media handles as at Don Eduardo Barca on Instagram if you need to find me. And please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. It'll help us. Thank you. All right. So this week, let's do a summary. This week, we're doing Israel and Palestine conflict. We are keeping up with the current events. Andy?
Yeah, let me just say that people probably heard last week when we had Hema on how we had talked about, our schools becoming more violent. This question of, is the shit hitting the fan, in the world kind of came up. And actually, we had actually done an additional episode with Hema that asks, what do you do when the shit hits the fan? And that was supposed to come this weekend. But this Saturday, literally a war reemerged. But this time a two-sided war emerged where Israel declared war on Palestine. Or on the Palestinians in the Gaza, in response to an attack laid out by the Hamas on several fronts, breaking out of Gaza. And the events of that, not only are they startling, but I think there's a lot of questions that I have. I have some perspective on things, but I have as many questions as I do perspectives on things. And so I wanted to bring that to this discussion here. And Kenny wanted to have that discussion. Eduardo, you definitely wanted to have that discussion. So this is what we're going to discuss this week, because it's a giant development in my opinion, and I think the implications. Well, I want to talk about what I think the implications are.
Yeah, so I'm as well interested, and I think we might find some connections with down south in Africa, as you had mentioned to me. Which I was supposed to go to Africa this year, but two countries near where I'm going to have had recent coups, so it's directly affected my trip, and I'm not able to go at this time. So why don't we go into let's do a summary of what's happened so far. Do you want to take over and share with us that summary, Andy, or should I? Because right now I'm just coughing away.
Yeah, why don't we do the thing where I'll say as many details as I can, and then people just add in what they have.
Yeah.
So out of the blue, obviously the occupation of Gaza is not out of the blue. The fact that the Palestinians have been living in a ghetto, in a concentration camp, in a city, in a region that is basically a concentration camp for decades. And they have been under attack. Their militants have been under attack, but their civilians have been under attack as well due to the occupation of that region. And we've talked here as well that behind this is a history of the fact that a region that was once Palestine in 1946 is now been divided up and carved up so that the Palestinians live on only a small patch of that land. And they have been their land has been occupied by settlers. These settlers call themselves Israelis, and that is an apartheid state was set up that has only rights for those Jewish Israeli settlers, and very few rights for the people who actually lived in that region before them. So this is an illegal occupation for the last, 46, 50, 60, 70 years, on the order of, and the plight of the Palestinians, I think, is on the order of what has happened to indigenous people in this country that were moved and pushed out, and there was resistance from them, and that by and large that resistance has mostly been defeated. But there continues to be resistance from the Palestinians. They want to avoid the thing that has happened, that sometimes happens to an indigenous population by an empire, which is to be eradicated, and they're trying to avoid their eradication. So out of that violence that the Palestinians live in was a pretty stunning series of events, like apparently from fighters from Hamas, which is one political group in Palestine. There are other political groups, and there's just one, and they have a military wing. There were some who went on to motorized vehicles by sea and launched an attack north of Gaza and took some territory. Some people broke through fences. Some people went onto paragliders and came in over paragliders. There was a military encampment occupied and taken over by the Palestinians that Israeli military had been at, and then they were surprised, and I think some were killed, some were taken hostage, and some were then taken back, I think, and now are in Gaza. People have heard about some of the settler territories that were there, which would be the settlers there in Israel who were in the southern what is called now southern Israel, were besieged by the Hamas. People were killed, people were taken prisoner, people fled, police stations were taken over, military people were also attacked, and this was just like everyone. No one saw this coming. In fact, Anthony Blinken only weeks ago had been saying that the Middle East, at least this part of the Middle East, is as quiet as it's ever been, kind of thing. And that's obviously this whole notion of how this happened is going to be part of what we discuss. Well, it did happen. I think thousands, or at least 1,000 Israelis were said to be killed. Those are the numbers I've heard, not 1,000s, but 1,000. And then, of course, there's talks about how did this happen, things like that. But then, the U.S. circles around. Obviously, Netanyahu, who has been a besieged prime minister of Israel, basically declares war pretty much immediately on Palestine and on Gaza. And then since that time, they've been amassing soldiers. And I think they've been doing shelling and flyover bombs of Palestine. And they're cutting energy, cutting food, cutting water, just basically sieging. This is like a region under siege, literally under siege. And this is what you would do when castles were sieged. You would starve and try to basically the enemy give by certainly hurling things into their walls, but also not letting no resources get inside. And so the entire population is now under siege in Gaza. And so it looks to be like the beginnings of what will be a guerrilla war, because there is talk of them going in, and they are marshaling forces on the outside of Gaza to go in. And there have been, at the same time, there's been on north of Israel, there have been now back and forth mortar and artillery between Hezbollah or Lebanon and Israel. And there's actually been attacks around Golan. I'm not sure if it's in the Golan Heights, but between Syrian forces and Israel in some regions. I haven't heard anything about what's going on in the West Bank. That's another region for things to happen. Gaza is more isolated, it's in the sea and within Israel itself. West Bank is connected to the other forces. And just geopolitically, obviously, U.S., the West, all the people who backed Ukraine, and Ukraine itself, have said we stand with Israel. China and Russia have basically called for peace, but in a more measured way, but have not gone on and said that they stand for Israel, but have seemingly not taken sides. And other powers, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, I think Iran have basically not said that the attacks were justified, but have basically said Israel should not go in and destroy Gaza, and seemingly are taking more the side of the Hamas fighters and the Palestinian cause. And so that's some of the things I would say as a background.
I would like to chime in. This comes after we had covered, for anyone who is interested, we have covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think twice, if I'm not mistaken. And in one episode, if people want to look back on that episode, each one of us covered a section or part of history and what's happening in the past and what's happened in current time. So I invite people to look at that episode because we covered extensively informative history lesson, so to speak, on this Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Today is the 12th of January, the 12th of October, and in Mexico it's Day of the Pluricultural Nation, or Día de la Nación Pluricultural, or Día de la Raza, and then this Monday was Day of People's Indigenous Day instead of celebrating Christopher Columbus. And so there have been, because there's a sunrise ceremony here in Alcatraz, where I have attended year after year, and this year I didn't go, I just for other reasons. But they've always brought to highlight the support and the solidarity for Palestine. And the 7th of October, was it that happened? I think it was Saturday. What was it? The 7th of October was the conflict, the surprise attack. And you have seen the left come out in support of this Palestinian, of the Palestinians, which great, wonderful. I'm glad. And we've said that that's great, but we'll get to what should really happen, right? And so I'm proud of the solidarity, but it's a hypocrisy because we'll get there. And all of this on this week being Dia de la Raza, People's Indigenous Day and stuff, right? And it was a surprise attack. I have my suspicions, if I can just go right into it, because, last time we covered Pegasus and spy, vigilante, surveillance from Israel. They have very strong surveillance apparatus. It's no kidding. Mexico is the biggest. It has become the biggest consumer of buying this spy surveillance program from Israel, which we even covered. They've been spying on the Zapatistas, the guerrilla force down in Chiapas. So it was, to me, the most interesting surprise attack, because I have thought to myself, if they are some of this network of vigilantes and the notorious spy tool to be used amongst some of the most best in the world, how did they get arms West Bank, which is like very small? How can you get supply? It's literally right there by the sea, and then blocked in sections as an open air prison, just by Israel right there. So how did they get the armed so without being noticed? This to me is suspicious, whether it is a surprise attack, as it has been reported. And so I get the sense that we are seeing possibly the expansion, rather, and the maybe this is one version. I don't know. I'm speculating here. You can all see maybe if this is debatable or not. Maybe the expansion of maybe Israel wanting to have an attack like this to justify its full-on throttle attack on the West Bank, because it's just the small piece that you need to. If you keep seeing, look at images. Maybe we'll put them here. I'll look for a video clip where the border keeps moving and moving and moving and moving and moving and expanding the entire Israel. And so to me, it's like, well, why don't you just take over the West Bank? But you're going to have to find a way to justify it. That's one way of seeing this. I think that I saw that on some people's analysis.
And
but,
1 second, Eduardo, and just to be clear,
ahead.
You've been saying West Bank, or are you saying Gaza?
Gaza. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Not West Bank. Sorry. Gaza. Sorry. Yeah, Gaza. I apologize. Thank you, Andy. I hope people, maybe So, it's to me, that's the part where I think it's very suspicious, knowing that they're one of the most strongest surveillance programs that they hold. I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that, because that may be a speculation of mine that may not be agreeable to both of you.
No, I actually share that suspicion. I don't yet know, like, for sure what I believe in that sense, because this incident has been referred in certain media that I've read. They've hinted at being Israel's 9/11. And as we know, 9/11 for the US was an excuse to go do other shit that had nothing to do with it. I do share that suspicion with you, Eduardo, that Gaza is one of the most surveilled pieces of land in the world. They have AI, they have cameras everywhere. They've had 70 years of, the Israelis have had 70 years of experience in perfecting and having guinea pigs, human guinea pigs, and so it is highly suspicious. So I do, maybe we'll address that later, like that, what roads that might take us, because was Israel really, surprised? Did they allow it? Because we also have to factor in that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, he's been in deep shit in the country. People have been on the streets en masse because he wanted to change the legal system, basically, to protect his ass. And there were masses of protests, not small, for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so that's a recent thing. And so obviously, when you have an external enemy, that's a very easy way to deviate attention and to, quote unquote, bring people together. But that's something else. I just want to add some details that I think are important. That you're talking about Gaza, right? And Gaza has been blockaded, since 2006. And Egypt is part of that blockade. So they're surrounded. They don't have anywhere to go. And like you said, they are basically landlocked because they can't even use the sea, because they have a air, sea, land blockade. Where Israel and Egypt, both allies of the U.S. are part of. Give me 1 second. I don't know the top. Sorry. Oh yes. The other thing is that this insane response, right? Like you said, Lipson, Netanyahu declared war pretty much immediately, and up to this morning, I heard reports that the Israeli government had said, or the military had said, that they dropped 6,000 bombs in less than a week on an area of 2.2 million people. That's pretty densely populated, where most of the people, half the people population, I think, are believed to be kids. It's a very young population, and to me, it doesn't sound like a war. It sounds like a genocide taking place. There are some reports that there are like 350,000 displaced people, within days of what happened. There's another thing to bring up in terms of like the media coverage, right? Western media, mainstream, they're all in line, as objective as they try to be. They're all in line, pushing a similar narrative. There was these reports of beheading of kids, right? That was being shoved down people's throats. That they suggested that Hamas, and I'm being cynical, right? Like, because again, the racist tropes, they're playing this in the background. The Hamas, these savages, beheaded 40 kids. And even the Israeli government hasn't confirmed that. And again, I take a pause as to what's reported, because we've been lied to. We know how this machinery works. And so that's in part why I want to have these conversations to see what we think, what kind of this stuff, can we believe? Because it's still very recent. It's a fog of war. And so I'm not so sure, like I'm not yet entirely convinced that this was a surprise on Israel. And so I'm curious, as to what you think about this.
Yeah, this has been what I've been going back and forth on. Like, I think what Eduardo is saying, that this was not a surprise, that this was a 9/11, that this was an operation even organized by Mossad, even organized by the U.S., by the CIA, is entirely possible. Is entirely possible. Like, that is not a silly position. That's like that one. One could even call that a likely position. Like, maybe the most likely one that some people have, and I think many people who are critical of what Israel is doing, who have avoided the "I stand with Israel" crap, are going there first. And I'll say at times I can see it that way, but I don't currently. And I'll tell you how I see what's going on. And in bringing this up with talking to my brother about it, and kind of came in a text that me and Joe and Heather and Brady were on, it became clear to me that when we talk about what we see in the world, really all we're doing is holding a mirror up to ourselves. I describe it like a Rorschach test. It's like an ink blot you put in front of yourself, and you say, "What pattern do you see?" And you always see patterns that are based on your psyche. So let's be clear: what you hear from me is not it's per se is not what's happening in the world. It is how Andy sees the world, and so that's my perspective. I bring to it, and I think that's what perspective we all bring to it. That's not to say there's no truth in any of it, but I really at this moment can see that if I saw the world one way, I would say one thing. And if I saw the world another way, I would say another. So here's how I look at it. First off, my view of this is I look at it in the framework of the entire globe going to war. I look at the framework. I don't look at it through the framework of Palestine, Israel, or even Iran, Palestine, Israel, or even Saudi Arabia, Iran, Palestine, Israel. I look at it through the realm of a world that has been divided up by the big powers and is currently being redivided. And that was one of the quotes, or a like quote, that Lenin had used about when he wrote the book Imperialism. The world had been divided, and it was in the process of being redivided that the age of imperialism emerged, when the markets had already been fully found, the resources had been fully found, but because of monopoly capitalism, the needs of finding more market and the needs of finding more resources came up against big powers whose monopolies were butting up against each other, and that was going to break out into local war, but then regional war, and then global war. And this was what he wrote about in this book called Imperialism. And that is the world we are in now. It is a world being redivided between China, United States, Russia. Europe wants to get in there. India wants to get in there. South America and Brazil wants to get in there. And you hear terms like BRICS. You hear terms like G8. You hear terms like World Economic Forum. And that is not a global to me, the World Economic Forum is very much a Western feature, not a global feature, even though people want to call it the base, the hub of the glue in the New World Order. And I look at this event as something that is very, in my opinion, if this is an event that was pursued by Israel and the United States, I think it's very bad planning, because I think this event right here, I believe, goes very well for China, very well for Russia, very well for the war, which still, the global war, the center of the global war, I still believe occurs in that fracture that's taking place in Ukraine. And Ukraine's counteroffensive has been defeated. And they are now in a position where I think that the tide is going to be turned. And even there have been stories of how ammunition reserves were taken from Israel to try to give them to Ukraine so their counteroffensive could be successful and so they could continue to fight. And all of that has been depleted. The West went into, I might go on for a while here. So the West went into that war. U.S. went into that war with the notion that they were going to use the Ukrainians to bleed Russia. But what has in fact happened is they tried to bleed Russia, and Russia has bled. But with the ounces of blood that Russia has shed, puddles of blood have been shed, not just by the Ukrainians, but by the United States and NATO in particular, is much weaker. militarily and even economically than it was when in the beginning of that war. And China and Russia have emerged much stronger. And so what you and that at that time you also seen a potential of a second front opening up in Taiwan with China and the United States saying, okay, we're gonna take you on here, but also realizing that they were going to have to fight two wars at the same time. And now we have a third front opening up, a third front in Israel with the Palestinians, and which is going to require the U.S. to marshal more resources to back essentially what is like a giant landed aircraft carrier of shock troops. Israel is the original proxy force. Everyone talks about Ukraine as the proxies. U.S.'s original proxies are the Israelis for fighting for U.S. oil interests in that region, and that's what the British use them for, and that's because it's never been about Jews. It's always been about the resources of the Middle East, and the British used the Israelis for that, the Israeli settlers, and now the U.S. are using those Israeli settlers for that. They are proxy fighters, willing proxy fighters, because they get paid good money, and they live a better life than the people around them, and there's a ton of money that goes into there, but that's what they are. They are proxy warriors. Well, this is now a new front opening up that's going to actually stretch the U.S. even more. And personally, I believe that if the U.S. was behind this, I think the U.S. has really screwed itself over. And if the U.S. if Israel was going to do this, they were definitely going to check with the United States. And I just don't see the United States wanting to open up this third front. That's just me. But I definitely believe that China and Russia and would definitely be looking to use Iran, as I do believe they are using them, to help push in the context of a very successful operation happening in Ukraine for Russia and China. They would definitely be willing to push their Israel. Iran is China's new Israel and Russia's ally as well in that region, to say, open up a new front. And we'll use your proxies. And in this case, the Palestinians, I believe, and their fight, that's going to draw in. I do believe this is going to be a wider war that's going to draw in the Hezbollah. It's going to draw in Iran as a funder for some of those forces. I think Syria is going to get involved. I think the powers that are organizing behind, that are getting more involved with China and BRICS, are going to find themselves all aligning ultimately against the United States and against Israel. In this case, they might not do it openly, but behind the scenes they'll be doing it, and they're going to continue to bleed Israel. And if they bleed Israel, that means they're bleeding the United States. And I think Israel, if it gets drawn into a guerrilla fight in Gaza, is going to find itself trapped in a way that Russia was trying, that the United States was trying to trap Russia with Ukraine, but has been unsuccessful. And so if Israel and the United States are behind this, I think they've fumbled badly. They've miscalculated badly. Personally, I do believe bigger powers are in play, and I don't believe Hamas acted independently. I believe that Hamas is acting with the understood support and understood resource, and it can come through Egypt, and it can come through many ways in terms of getting into Gaza. That's what I believe is if you will, behind this. And they're being used, the Palestinians are being used as another big power proxy in that region. Do I have proof for this? No. But I don't think in this case Hamas has the capability I just don't believe they're acting independently. And if you ask me who benefits from this, I think Russia and China benefit from it. I think Iran's going to become a bigger player, and I think Israel is going to find itself in a much, much weaker position. And U.S. is going to find itself in even a weaker position. Its ammunition stores are tapped, and now they're even saying. I was telling Kenny this, that for the first time, Kirby, who's a spokesperson for the Biden administration, for the first time has said, "Look, we can't fund both Ukraine and Israel, so Ukraine may have to understand that we're at the end of our rope for funding." And if that means U.S. is admitting defeat in order to actually support Israel, which is what you'd have to do if you're a big power trying to hold on, then you have really fucked yourself if you put yourself in that position. Because now you have to retreat from a place that you thought you were going to have victory and retreat to here, and they're going to be defeated here as well, in my opinion, because I believe this is not a war that's going to end. it's going to be a war that will expand and extend because it's part of this. It's part of a global war that's taking place. And as Kenny or as Eduardo pointed out, that war is even happening in Africa right now. These coups that have taken place are not just coups out of the blue. Wagner forces, Russia is acting behind them. China's presence is in those coups, and they're trying to oust the French, trying to oust the United States. And the United States are trying to get back in with their forces. So proxy wars are emerging everywhere on the globe because world war is here, and it's gathering a pace. And I believe what you're seeing is a new front opening in the world war. And I think it's a front opened up by China and Russia and Iran. And I think it's one that maybe if Israel thought they were getting something from this, I think they've just miscalculated. So for me, I am open to the idea that this was a
surprise,
some level of surprise. And I'll just say one last thing from people who have also thought that. This guy Alistair or something or another who was being interviewed, and he said, look, number one, Israel has immense respect for Hezbollah. Those are other fighters that are going to be involved in this as well. I forgot if I didn't mention them from Lebanon. Has much respect for Hezbollah, but always thinks Hamas is a joke. And secondly, he actually said that the emphasis of intelligence on AI and data collection has actually weakened the industry because they have less influence on having humans on the ground in places. And that was an interesting point. Like this new thing that everyone's saying is going to, revolutionize things and make it, in many ways, there's a weakness to it. So again, I myself have a tough time believing this could be a complete surprise. But in terms of geopolitically, who I think gains from this, if Israel and the United States were behind this, I think they've totally miscalculated. And so because I think this is horrible for the United States in relationship to it trying to regain global hegemony. And I think a new front has been opened that's going to mean that they're going to bleed out even more in another direction. And China and Russia and Iran are going to advance regionally as a result of that. So that's why I see it the way I see it. So sorry, that was a long.
No, I have a question. So, so those were the two roads that I was exploring. It's is Israel and the U.S. planning this, right? And what do they get out of it? And is China, who's doing the offensive, the tactical move here? And I see what you're saying, I've also thought about that. But so then I ask about Hamas, obviously the consequences of their action have been, very much disproportional. I understand, right, that Hamas, Ukraine, Palestinian people, the Israeli people, they're all pawns in the game that's much, much bigger. And as we've seen in Ukraine, the big players that are making the big moves, they're willing to put people in a fucking meat grinder. And so I understand, so what does Hamas get out of this? If there was, tacit support, where is it? Was it just logistical? And those are just questions that I have, because I don't think they're dumb. They are playing their cards to some degree, right? And of course there's a level of desperation when you're fucking subjugated so much. But if what do they get out of it?
Well, can I say something about that, Kenny? Eduardo? Okay. First off, Hamas's roots are not out of the independent struggle of the Palestinian people. Hamas's origins comes out of Israel and the United States looking to find an Islamic counterweight to secular movements that were looking to take down Israel, that were connected more to the former Soviet Union and to socialism and communism. So there were groups like the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and even in the Iranian Revolution, that when not Mossadegh, but when the Shah got taken down, there were secular forces that looked to take power that had connection to the Communist Party. And the United States and Israel have always wanted to take those forces out, because that was their biggest fear of secular, nationalist, and even communist movements taking over the Middle East. So their counterweight was to basically fund and support groups that have origins through the Muslim Brotherhood, like Hamas. And even Hezbollah has links to that kind of stuff. Sort of, they were trying to basically find an Islamic counterweight that was they felt they could control much more easily than these secular movements that they felt were out of their control and were often under the control of the former Soviet Union. So they themselves also were patsies, were not as independent as they needed to be. So I don't think Hamas has roots as an independent force among the Palestinians. And that doesn't make them stupid. It just means I feel like they've always been compromised. And currently, I believe that Hamas has been more a tool of Iran recently than of Israel and the United States. So that's why I think that this seems like more something where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or the whatever the Mossad of the Iranian government, in my opinion, would play more a hand in training and helping Hamas, and even in the timing of this. And I think Russia and China probably were told that this is something that could be done, and I think they just basically let the dog off the leash and they let her run, because it's like the time is now. Because I think that the timing of this, to me, feels very close to a turn in the war in Ukraine. And this, to me, looks like it puts an immense amount of pressure on the United States and the West in the context of them already having lost an offensive that they bet everything on, the so-called Ukrainian counteroffensive. And that thing has been crushed, and almost maybe up to 100,000 lives were lost just in the counteroffensive alone of Ukrainians. And now they've got nothing. And now they are facing a massively stronger Russian army on that front. And at that very time, a new front's going to open up, so the U.S. has to start to put forces there. That does not seem like a good move for the United States. And if this was done by Israel without consultation with the United States, then that's a giant mistake. So that's why I totally understand people's reasons for doubts, but for me, this just looks like something that is controlled, but controlled by the powers that right now have initiative, and that is not the United States. That is China and Russia. And I don't say, some people hear that as like, oh my God, that's China. No, but I don't say that as a criticism. All I can say is I support the right of the Palestinians for liberation, but currently all big powers are going to get themselves involved in any liberation struggle, and everyone's going to find themselves being used and abused some way, shape, or form. The people in Donbass are being used by the Russians, just like the Ukrainians are being used by the people and that's what's happening here in Palestine. A completely justified fight for liberation is going to be turned into a proxy war for some big power. That's just the reality, unfortunately, folks. And last thing, our role here in this country is to defeat our own government and get its hands out of that region, regardless of what Iran is doing, what Russia is doing, what China is doing. Our role is not to stop Russia, not to stop China. Our role is to stop the U.S. government in its intervention into that region, and then, of course, take our own government down and not allow it to intervene anywhere in the globe, and remove its fingers everywhere it has it.
Can you, or?
Yeah, no, it's a lot to think about for me. Like I said, I didn't know what to make of it fully. Like, I thought about these moves, didn't fully see, those connections. I guess the other thing that because when you post this topic, like we talked about blood in the water, right? Like, do the challenging powers smell some weakness in the U.S. and like, because you talked about how like that spokesperson for the U.S. said that they couldn't fund, like Like I don't, because I've heard that I don't see it as being just about the money. It's about the industrial war capacity, because that's one argument that I've heard about Ukraine, that the West doesn't have the industrial capacity to sustain a world war. You know, if you were to go to, so they would be really fucked. You know, in like honest, in the you see that logic in this conflict, and the U.S. is drawn, and other forces force the U.S. hand because they are moving carriers. That way, and they have to do a show of force too behind their biggest asset, right? Like in that region, and it is a very interesting argument that the U.S. is somewhat on its heels, and which actually scares me more, right? Because we've talked about the nuclear option, the Samson option for Israel, and the U.S. obviously, and just wanted to bring that up. Like the whole argument that the West doesn't have the industrial capacity to have a world war, an industrial war.
And to say that while the U.S. and NATO capacity has been exposed as weak and suffering and fragile in comparison, through this conflict in Ukraine, Russia's capacity for war has grown massively. Like it is producing millions of shells per year compared to the United States tens of thousands of shells, and it's not even close. And their ability to marshal their military and their training of their own military now, in terms of the actual implementation of satellites and ISR technology, they now have a trained military that can fight a modern war. The U.S. does not. It fought people in trucks, and so the U.S. is so exposed. Why would the U.S. open up another front into which its small capacity and inability to fight a war? It makes no sense that they would open up a new front in fighting when their capacity has been so exposed. And that's one reason. I just don't see how they could be the authors of this action.
And the last thing, I guess, just on that, is that like the U.S., Afghanistan, Iraq, they didn't really fight formidable industrial opponents, right? Like, which we're talking about Russia now, that has gained a lot of experience in modern warfare, like World War style, like meat grinder type of war. And that's an experience that the U.S. and Israel do not have. And on top of that, the industrial capacity is compromised because we haven't even seen it, right? Like in allies of quote unquote Ukraine, they were pulling out because they're like, we're depleting our own resources, so we cannot continue to help you.
I'm sorry, part of one last myth that was punctuated.
No, it's fine.
And remember, what they were saying in Ukraine was, wait till we get the Challenger tanks, wait till we get the Bradleys, wait till we get, and they got them all. They gave them maybe not as much as they needed, but a bunch. And those things ended up fucking in flames on the field there. And they could not move more than kilometers through basic Russian. They barely got to the first line of defense. These forces were found on the fields of what the crumple zone, which were basically just a section of the Russian defenses that were meant to be defeated, because then you would slow your opponent down as they approach your first line of defense. Once you penetrate your first line of defense, then you come to the second and then the third. And they had actually constructed a fourth. The U.S. material and the Western material barely even got to the first line of defense, and that was just in the Robotny. Everywhere else, it only existed in what's called that squeezy zone that was meant to collapse, and it didn't even collapse that. Instead, what you had were hundreds of vehicles in flames in that region. So the U.S. found itself exposed as a paper tiger, really, in terms of thinking that it had this great military, this great technology that was going to game change a war, and instead it's all done nothing. And all it's done is ended in defeat in relationship to a global power. And that, I think, is extremely worse in the United States. Again, how did they gain opening up a new front in that context? To me, the only people who gain by opening up a new front are the people who are winning. And the people who are winning are Russia and China.
I guess I'll say this. and to reiterate, like that I'm saying that the U.S. might be on its heels doesn't mean they're out of the fight. It actually makes the prospects of nuclear war more
likely.
likely.
I agree.
Well, I mean, I wanted to factor into all of this as well. Just like, I think it was it just that just wanted to get some clarity. Was it the assets being released to Iran right before the Hamas attack? Right, there's some assets because South Korea had bought oil from Iran, and then it was because of sanctions there was it was held, and then it was and then it was released. And then that's what the Republicans are now saying, that that's part of the reason why all of this is happening. Both Democrats and Republicans are supportive of Israel's, they're united on this front. But I'm just trying to figure out how this comes into factor in, because I believe Iran has been been supportive of the Palestinians, whereas Saudi Arabia and they've made a pact with Israel to move forward, as we've covered before as well.
What I would say about that, and I know I'm doing a lot of talking, but is I don't see that as indicative, as the indicator of Iranians' involvement. To me, what is more convincing to me that Iran would be involved in this way was the recent peace deal struck by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran. To me, the entrance of Saudi Arabia into BRICS cements the possibility of Iran acting more boldly, and therefore Hamas acting more boldly in that region because of those geopolitical changes that have been taking place. And that's how I see, and that's why I don't like, people said, oh, well, this Hamas is doing this to make Saudi Arabia break a deal that's happening between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That thing was never, in my opinion, Israel was never going to make some kind of peace with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia had already made peace with Iran, and Saudi Arabia is already being wooed onto BRICS. They've already taken sides on this, folks. It's over. It's like Saudi Arabia is going to try to play both sides a little bit, but by and large, they smell the blood in the water, and they know that the future is with China and Russia and with BRICS. It ain't with the United States. That's what it looks like to me. And so why would they go with a loser like Israel, which really means going with a loser like the United States, when they've got a giant power? Yes, and China is having economic problems, but here's what it's not facing. It's not in a global war right now. The U.S. is in Britain's situation, and China is in the U.S. situation. Britain is facing global war with Germany here, and faced World War I, World War II. The United States can kick back and be like, we're sometimes in a war. We give both sides sometimes, and when we want to get involved, we get involved. That's the situation China's in. China's right now watching everyone else fight and be able to kick back and be like, well, we'll fund the sides we want to fund. We're on our side. And that's the situation they find themselves in. So it's like every one of these conflicts only strengthens China more geopolitically in the long run.
And I guess this is a rhetorical question. Maybe we can at some point, or if you want to answer, but like I don't know much about China's own war industry. Like I wonder how that looks. And
one last thing, and this, Eduardo, you and I did this in an episode. We talked about, it was 3 years ago, we talked about a massive investment deal struck between Iran and China that was like, ports are being organized by China, all sorts of intelligence data is going to be collected together. It was almost a complete mirror image of what the United States had set up with Israel, being set up between China and Iran about 2 or 3 years ago. To me, that sort of thing is really what allows people to understand why what's happening is happening. I don't think it has much to do with a recent $6 billion. To me, that's just politics. They're trying to say those folks are there, don't vote for them. But I don't think it reveals geopolitically what's taking place in the world. And I don't know the military situation of China in terms of, except to say that the one I know the most is it building its Navy stronger and stronger. And the U.S. is now wondering if China has a stronger Navy than them, except for the submarine fleet, which the U.S. has the strongest in the world, supposedly.
I think that the aircraft carriers, the U.S. has more, but in terms of number of ships, China has more ships in
Yeah.
numbers. They're
Yeah.
just more.
Yeah. And many people, the fact that U.S. does not have hypersonic missiles and Russia and China do, give people reason to believe that those aircraft carriers will be sunk within minutes when a war starts, because the hypersonic missiles cannot be shot down by any Iron Dome. There's no Iron Dome to get down hypersonic missiles. All those things do is go straight to any aircraft carrier and sink it. And that's what's going to happen.
You know, it's funny because leftists are supportive of the Ukrainian war. You know, they're supportive of this. And then they're supportive of the Palestinian independence. But I don't know how, you know, we see Biden being so supportive of Israel and now wanting to bundle Taiwan, Israel, and the Ukraine into a funding so they can get money for military spending in Congress. And it's like those nations are not the same. And anytime, and it's like it's the hypocritical part that I think it's like, how can you say you want any country to have their sovereignty and to be so independent, but Israel has been occupying Palestine for a very long time. And I just feel that these independence movements, they're also just like the one in Taiwan, and we've discussed the Ukraine. It's a bit, and the Rojava, I think it was as well in Syria. Being in allies with the USA, it's like it already taints your relationship with the people who are trying to get those that independence. That I think was that to me was the most striking when we covered Syria and we covered the Rojava. Do you remember, Andy? And I said to you, you know, how the USA just abandoned them when they were done being used for the US, then suddenly they found themselves at war with Turkey because there's a war there with the Kurds. And I thought to myself, these are supposed to be these anarchists, these independent. And I even felt like I was defending them when we had an episode, you and I were arguing and debating about this. And I said, look, they really are working towards an independent, like a guerrilla force. And you just said, well, it's too late. This is an example. What we need to cover is an example of how when you ally yourself with the U.S. American forces, you're screwed. They're not really backing you. They're going to just use you for what they politically need at that moment. And they should have never accepted that friendship. And we see this with Taiwan. They should not accept it as well with the USA and the Ukrainians as well. I can see the power and the passion in trying to have their independence, but they shouldn't accept it then from the USA. And so I think of this, and I think about how when the leftists call for like intervention, are we asking the U.S. American forces to intervene that has a long history of wanting to intervene and take over? Like, this is what they're calling for, you know? I don't think Israel could really be on its own 2 feet without USA, because it's surrounded by so many of those, Lebanon and then Iran, like they're just right there, right? So they really need that power, but they also could gain that support from Russia, maybe, I don't know. And then the USA wouldn't want that, because you still need that base in the Middle East and that ally. And it's looking quite, what? Can go ahead?
No, but again, like you said, citing. Let's just talk about the U.S., right? The devil that we know. I'll say that the U.S. is also willing to fight until the last Israeli. Like, yes, they're allies, and they'll be useful, but that's their first line of defense. Let's just call it that. The Israelis are not safe. Like, I'm not going to play that whole perpetual victim card, because like they're not the only people that have faced genocide and like, not to diminish that, but whatever. The point is that they are on the front lines. They are, as much as they are the visual dog that the U.S. releases on the region, the U.S. is gonna be willing for them to get exterminated, if it means sustaining their empire or destroying their opponents. And so, like it's not just about like, and in some ways, I think that's the same thing for the Palestinians. Look, they're getting fucking bombed. That's what I was asking that question. Why the fuck do they get? Where is the support? Because they're getting fucking annihilated. But again, the big players are moving their pieces, and this is proxy war, like I said, everywhere. And like that was the world war. That was the world wars in Northern Africa, in the Pacific, in Europe. And then the Cold War in Latin America, that we don't consider it as vicious, but a fucking lot of people died too, through proxies. And so this is the game, and I agree with you, Lipson. Like this is a repartition, like I do see that more. There is blood in the water. The challengers do feel bold. They're not making like hesitant moves, and we've discussed like in the past, like it's like I don't know who said it, but like it took 2 world wars to like push the British Empire to the background. And the U.S. is the latest, with the most technology, the furthest reach, and so challenging the U.S. It's going to be a bloody affair. But it is, this is why the Russians went on an offensive in Ukraine, right? Because it is an existential fucking move. You got to go for the win. In like even those alliances, like that's further down the road, like the Russian and Chinese alliances and the Iranians, even those are tentative. And so, but the people who get fucked are the people in the middle, like first, but let's not mistake it, we're actually all at risk here. Because like we said before, this game can get out of hand. And, I guess, I don't know why, but I just want to say that it's also fascinating to me, right? Like how Israel is like the most highly educated populations in the world. And yet they're pawns in this game. They're not leading. They're not, they're not game changers. I mean, they're not like the big players. It has high technology surveillance, tactical shit that they've exported to the world. They were also a proxy to the U.S. in that way because they've gone to Latin America, for example, to train people in oppressive tactics, torture, and all this shit. And yet they're not far behind the Palestinians.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say this, and I maybe that I have a question about. They are being used. You are right. They are proxies in the same way that currently the Palestinians are being used as proxies, and unfortunately everyone's being used as proxies. But this question of, well, do you stand with Israel or do you stand with Palestine? I stand with Palestine, and I don't think Hamas represents an independent movement of the Palestinians for liberation. But I don't know what it does at this point in the globe right now. I don't know where that independent movement is. I definitely don't stand with Israel. I stand with Palestine. And for me, what has been exposed, and I have been glad that even the left that has been so lame on all this fourth industrial revolution at least remembers itself enough to know that it doesn't stand with Israel at this time. Because what to me has been exposed in terms of the movement is the freedom movement. Much of the freedom movement, and of course RFK Jr. is the poster child for this, but even Naomi Wolf. What did all these people worry about? They were worried about censorship, fourth industrial revolution, big tech coming in, geofencing, a global technocratic control grid that was being built on the globe. Who do you think lives in exactly that? the Palestinians. They literally live in that technocratic trap that you're so worried about. That Naomi Wolf was writing articles in the last 2 years about saying we can't be put in that. Let's get out of that. So Israel, this thing with Hamas comes, Israel fucking hammers them. And what does Naomi Wolf say? I stand with Israel. Oh, don't kill them all, but I stand with Israel. I was like, are you kidding me? Israel are the forces of the technocratic trap. They're the ones who built it there. Of course, with the United States helping and things like that. So it is shocking to me how quickly people forget their principles in just a short period of time. And so I'm not even going to go on the left on this one. This isn't a left issue. This is actually people who are on the right, who are in the center. This is my folk in the freedom movement. They are not free, but they are dumb. That's the part of the freedom movement that they seem to have collected. The dumbness that is able to be fooled so quickly by if you're afraid of the fourth industrial revolution, then look at the world the Palestinians live in, because that's where we're all headed. So why would you support their continued subjugation? Why would you even hesitate when there's some notion of trying to break out of that somehow the forces that close them in that penitentiary should be emboldened to go back in and screw those people up forever daring to get out? It's like, dude, that's our future. It was said, but we are all Palestinians here at this point. We're all going to be living in that world, and it's going to get grimmer and grimmer and grimmer. And I think it's race to the bottom. So to me, the fact that people who say they fight for freedom in the same way that they can't seem to get open borders, I would say this is worse, actually. The fact that they don't get, they literally are fooled by a moment like this. If you're for Israel right now, then you are for technocracy. You are for the fourth industrial revolution. I don't care what you say. If you can tell me you're against the World Economic Forum, fuck off. You're for Israel. Israel is the fourth industrial revolution. They're doing it. They're the leading special forces putting that thing in operation. That's going to be spreading it for the United States and the West. So that's the part that is crazy to me. And this is the part where it's like, I'm not even criticizing the left at this point. Maybe part of it. I'm criticizing the freedom movement because I don't think it stands for freedom if it stands with Israel. So you're wrong. You are for slavery. You are for technocracy. You are Klaus Schwab's bitch. And that's I don't know what to tell you other than that, if you stand with Israel. So that's it.
I don't think it's that different than, the people who got manipulated by the repenting, unvaccinated person on the deathbed. They're that was used to push that narrative. And to me, I understand your frustration and I share that, but it also obviously points at how fucking easy, we talked about this before we recorded, that how easy it shows that time and time again, the fuckers who run the world, our world, the one where we're propagandized so much, they're so easily fucking chop things up. Oh no, you're together in this topic, we'll divide you in this topic. You're together on that topic, we'll divide you on that fucking topic. You thought you had an alliance, fuck you, you don't have an alliance. But like you said, I do think it comes down to principles. Even when it's hard, right? You have to ask your questions and stand by that. And that's the only way I see it. Just like people abandon principles of freedom and no borders during the vaccine mandates and all that bullshit. Again, it's happening again. I hear fucking Jimmy Dore talking, the show that, they're fucking up. They're talking about regulating the border, for example. A good fucking immigration system. What the fuck does that mean? And that is in close relationship with what you're talking about. The control of Palestinians, which is one of the highest examples of what our future would look like, or is starting to look like more and more. And so, yes, there is cognitive dissonance going on often, and we all have to check ourselves. Because I'm not going to pretend I haven't been fooled, and I won't be fooled. But it's also where we regroup and we say, I was wrong on that shit, right? And so, yes, I agree with you. A lot of people who we were 1,000% on the same side on this, vaccine passport, vaccine, all this bullshit that was being shoved down our throats. I don't think they're exploring this shit further, far enough, like to the full extent. What does freedom actually fucking mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm appreciative that we're going and delving into what people's positions are, and to see the hypocrisy if they're going to stand and say things, whether it be on the left or the right, which we know those are kind of black and white. Wherever we stand with that, it's just going to be a calling out of the hypocrisy that they should be aware of, and they need to make up their mind about. I'm glad you brought up those points, both of you. I thought for a second you were talking about Naomi Klein, but you're talking about Naomi Wolf, who has been so you're muted.
Be clear, yeah, it's Naomi Wolf, because I was impressed. I was very disappointed by the positions Naomi Klein took recently around the vaccine, big pharma, things like that. Naomi Wolf, who was not, in my opinion, who was not as much an anti-capitalist as Naomi Klein, she was great about talking about the fascist state that is rising around the surveillance state and the U.S. state. And suddenly, she just, in my opinion, she literally flipped when you say you stand with Israel. And I see that happening. I'm not going to say I see it happening on the left. I see it happening in this freedom movement. And I see it happening on its right wing, in its center wing, and parts of its left wing. So it's like, that's ridiculous. And I really agree with what Kenny said. It's like, dude, look how easily we got cracked again. I thought we learned a whole set of lessons out of the last 2 or 3 years, but we didn't learn shit. That's what it looks like to me.
Let's not talk about, like, I'm not, like most leftists that just sprinkle in racism and shit, but I understand racism as a function of this system, right? For exploitation of everyone. And yet, how easily many people have accepted these narratives of, again, the Islamic savages, the irrational Islamic savages, and let's support Israel.
Is there something to say about what we should say regarding Iran and their drones in Russia, and how they are, and they're just, I feel like, is there anything we need to say around that? Or even just the Wagner group in Mali with the coup, which is Russia. Is there anything around that? So I feel like what's happening in the Middle East and in Greater Africa in general is there's a huge investment, right? China, Russia, they're all trying to come into, and that's why there is a support towards Iran. There's a support towards the coups happening in Africa from China and even Russia, and how there are alliances being made where it's taking almost the throne of the USA that has been in power in this whole globe for the longest time. And now we're seeing powers emerge. So I'm not sure if there's something to say about that, but that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing just a shift in the way that we think of global powers, because just even the alliance of North Korea and Kim Jong-un going over there, on a train in a very, this was a symbolic thing because his previous ruler had done so as well. I think it was his father, right? I'm not sure, remember. And so had done so as well by train. And there was, so I guess what I'm just saying is there are new alliances, there are new investments, and I'm seeing that connection. And as you mentioned with BRICS, which the USA was not invited to, and Brazil having taken a stance of, yeah, we're not going to be for, the Ukrainian conflict. And this is what for me, I guess what I'm just coming to terms with is, I don't know how, I think this is how the USA is scrambling to find its hold. And that's the reason why I believe it's still going to hold on to Israel. So I'm just pointing things out because I'm trying to find connections. I'm just trying to find connections, trying to piece things, like we're like looking at a puzzle, And like I'm showing, oh, maybe this might be a work here. We'll put this to the side or whatever, and we'll see this. How could this connected?
There's like we've talked about a possible episode right on Africa because I don't know much of what's going on. I suspect the same things. We know that the world chessboard, is getting reshuffled, right? Like pieces, and people are picking alliances and placing their bets on the winners. But that is to me further indication that the people who run the world know that some shit is coming, and it's not going to be a peaceful thing. But I do eventually want to, talk about Africa, but I think it deserves its own like episode.
Yeah, I think Eduardo, you did a good job framing the conversation that we'll have around Africa. That will, in this backdrop, be thinking about Taiwan, thinking about Ukraine, and now thinking about what's going on in Israel. And so now I just think we need to kind of have another episode that goes more deeply into that.
But and again, it does right, like it does indicate a world event, world war type of stuff.
Yeah, and one last thing that this does tell me though is that I don't think the U.S. has the initiative any longer in the globe. I think the initiative is held by other powers, and that's the part that people are thinking this was an Israeli plan, which really does mean this was a U.S. plan. It is a world in which U.S. has the initiative globally and is making everyone else react. I think that world has shifted now, and I think China and Russia are now making everyone else react and making the U.S. react, and that's probably my biggest reason for seeing it this way versus seeing it the way that I think makes complete sense when people say this is just a false flag created by the Israeli government to do this, And people who are saying that are not, they have complete credibility, and I understand it. And actually, I have a tough time with some of their points and some of the points you've raised, but it doesn't make sense when I think about what's happening globally. And I think we haven't figured out, I believe, well, my hypothesis is that the initiative on the globe has changed from U.S. setting the tune to China and Russia setting the tune, and that's what's happening now. And so U.S. is reacting now, and so that's why I don't see them taking a move like this.
As we conclude, the horrific images that are coming through on what's happening with civilians in the crossfire, I just can't open up a social media because I think I'm just connected to the political side of not just like, beauty and whatever. And you just see images and images, and it's so hard. And I just feel for the people in the crossfire, and the Palestinians that don't have anywhere to run. That those images are haunting, and I've tried to just listen and listen and listen. And thank you, by the way, that link. Maybe we'll share it, Andy. I don't know if you want to share about your disagreements to that guy who's ex-U.S. military.
Yeah, I think he's got some of the best resources, even if I don't fully agree with what he's saying. The new Atlas, Brian Berletic, he's a U.S. military guy. So I will put that link to his site because he's been very informative to me. What I want to cite is if people think like the numbers of people dying here are tiny in relationship to the level of blood the U.S. is willing to shed, and the level of innocent blood the U.S. is willing to shed. And I want to give an exact example of when Madeleine Albright was asked by Leslie Straw from 60 Minutes and was faced with the fact that, look, your U.S. policies of sanctions on Iraq have been responsible, from the UN said, for killing 500,000 children. 500,000 children. That's the outcome of your policies. 500,000 children dead in the region. What do you make of that? Is that worth it? That's what was the question asked to Madeleine Albright. This is just one fucking flunky of the U.S. And she immediately said, it's a tough call, but we think it's worth it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know you're seeing things on the television. You're watching rave concerts get attacked. That's a bad thing. but our government thinks killing 500,000 children is worth it. So that's the numbers they're talking about. They don't talk in terms of hundreds of dead people, thousands of dead people. They think in terms of hundreds of thousands of dead people when they think about, is their policy worth it? And I don't think there's a number high enough to reach that. If as long as it enriches and empowers them, then those people got to go. So let's just put aside the sadness, the grief, oh my God, the women and children, because these are the people you're dealing with. They're willing to kill hundreds of thousands of children for nothing, except for power. And they say it. So just remember that. And I'll probably put, like you do it, I'm going to put that little clip in.
Please do. I was going to say so. Yeah.
And again, they've already done it. Like, it's not like it's a possibility. They already have done it plenty of times.
Yeah. Well, let's see what unfolds as we see more of
and
the story.
My prediction is that this is going to be a long war, but the part of this that goes against another, it looks like the U.S. is looking to get out of financially backing Ukraine, and that is a surprise to me. Like, I don't see how they can do that. I don't see how they're going to be able to extract their hand and not receive a massive defeat geopolitically and a massive victory for their biggest opponent. So that part is surprising to me. But I predict that this is not going to be a short war. It's going to be bloody. It's going to mean a lot of casualties. And I think it's going to be very harmful. And it's going to be very hurtful to Israel and its policies and what it's trying to do there. I think Hezbollah is going to be drawn in. I do think the other countries are going to be supporting and bleeding Israel, and thereby bleeding the United States through this proxy war. That's my prediction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's see what it turns out to be then.
Yeah.
All right. It looks like I'm catching something.
I got sick this weekend.
Oh.
I got a sore throat, stuffy nose, and I felt kind of weak.
You might just be making that up, according to Jeffree Star.
I didn't say it was due to a virus. I just said I got sick. So don't.
Well, what do you think? What do you think you're sick of, Andy Lipson?
Toxins.
I'm sick of Eduardo being late to this episode, these episodes.
I was late because you didn't remind me today.
And I'm sick of making false promises. I should stop doing that.
And I'm sick of hearing this bickering.
Yes, yeah. FYI. Okay, let's end first. All right. Well, thank you, Andy, really for calling me up, saying we should do this.
Yep.
I really think that this is important. Well, it's just like the Ukrainian war. It's going to be an ongoing topic. I think we just have to cover. And thank you for your analysis. And Kenny, thank you for showing up and giving your analysis as well. When you show up, it really does. You give another perspective as well. And let's do this. Looking for the outro. Okay, go. Here we go. All right, so that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenge in the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you fancy anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Google Play, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can also find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes, wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. And I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Kenny Cepeda and Andy Lipson, and we'll see you next time. And my social, I forgot. And you can find also our social media handles you can find mine on Instagram as @Don Eduardo Barca. All right. Thank you all for listening. Ciao.